Sometime between the 8th and 6th millennia BCE, pastoralism and then agriculture developed in northern Africa and southwestern Asia, and as the population grew, an ancient tongue spoken in this region fissured into the modern day languages of the Afro-Asiatic family. This family includes the Cushitic, Semitic, and Almodic languages now spoken in Ethiopia. During the second millennium BCE, cereal grains and the use of a plow were introduced into Ethiopia, possibly from the region of the Sudan, and people speaking Gez, a Semitic language, came to dominate the rich northern highlands of Tigray. There in the 7th century BCE, they established the kingdom of Damat. This kingdom dominated lands to the west, obtaining ivory, tortoiseshell, rhinoceros horn, gold, silver, and slaves, and trading them to South Arabian merchants. After 300 BCE, Damat deteriorated as trade routes were diverted eastward for easier access to coastal ports, and a number of smaller city-states arose in its place. Subsequent wars of aggrandizement led to unification under the inland state of Aksum, which from its base on the Tigray Plateau controlled the ivory trade into the Sudan, other trade routes leading farther inland to the south, and the port of Adulis in the Gulf of Zula. Aksum's culture comprised of Giz, written in modified South Arabian alphabet, sculpture, and architecture based on South Arabian prototypes, and an amalgam of local and Middle Eastern deities. Thus, evidence exists of a close cultural exchange between Aksum and the Arabian Peninsula. But the traditional scholarly view that South Arabian immigrants actually peopled and created pre-Aksumite or northern Ethiopia is increasingly under siege. Nevertheless, the ancient cultural exchange across the Red Sea became enshrined in Ethiopian legend in the persons of Makeda, the queen of Sheba, and the Israelite king Solomon. Their mythical union was said to have produced Menelik I, the progenitor of Ethiopia's royal dynasty. By the 5th century CE, Aksum was the dominant trading power in the Red Sea region. Commerce rested on sound financial methods, attested to by the minting of coins bearing the effigies of Aksumite emperors. In the anonymous Greek travel book, Perplus Maris Ertharo, written in the 1st century CE, Adulis is described as an open harbor containing a settlement of Greco-Roman merchants. It was through such communities established for the purpose of trade that the Christianity of the Eastern Mediterranean reached Ethiopia during the reign of the Emperor Azanis. By the mid-5th century, monks were evangelizing among the Cushitic-speaking Agab people to the east and south. The Ethiopian church opted to follow the leadership of the Coptic Church in Alexandria in rejecting the Christology proposed at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And breaking with the bishops of Rome and Constantinople. At its height, Aksum extended its influence westward to the kingdoms of Meroe, south towards the Omo River, and eastward to the spice coast of the Gulf of Aden. Even the South Arabian kingdom of the Himyarites across the Red Sea in what is now Yemen came under the suzerainty of Aksum. In the early 6th century, the Emperor Caleb was strong enough to reach across the Red Sea in order to protect his co-religionists in Yemen against persecution by a Jewish prince. However, Christian power in South Arabia ended after 572 when the Persians invaded and disrupted trade. They were followed 30 years later by the Arabs, whose rise in the 7th and 8th centuries cut off Aksum's trade with the Mediterranean world. As Christian shipping disappeared from the Red Sea, Aksum's towns lost their vitality. The Aksumite state turned southward, conquering adjacent grain-rich highlands. Monastic establishments moved even farther to the south. For example, a major church was founded near Lake Haik in 9th century. Over time, one of these subject peoples, the Agao, learned Gez became Christian and assimilated their Aksumite oppressors to the point that Agao princes were able to transfer the seat of the empire southward to their own region of Lasta. Thus, the Zagwe dynasty appeared in Ethiopia. Later, ecclesiastical texts accused this dynasty of not having been of pure Solomonic stock. But it was in the religious plane that the Zagwe nonetheless distinguished themselves. At the Zagwe capital of Roha, modern-day Lalibela, the Emperor Lalibela directed the hoeing of 11 churches out of the living rock, a stupendous monument to Christianity, which he and the other Zagwes fostered along with the Ethiopianization of the countryside. However, Zagwe hegemony was never complete, with opposition continued among the Semitic-speaking elite of Tigray to the north and the newly emergent Amhara people to the south. The opposition increasingly focused on questions of Solomonic legitimacy. In 1270, a leading nobleman of the province of Shiwa, Yakono Amlak, rebelled. He was supported by an influential faction of monastic churchmen who condoned his regicide of the emperor and legitimated his descent from Solomon. The genealogy of the new Solomonic dynasty was published in the early 14th century, a collection of legends that related the birth of Menelik I, associated Ethiopia with the Judeo-Christian tradition, and provided a basis for Ethiopian national unity through the Solomonic dynasty, Semitic culture, and Amharic language. Well-armed ideologically, the Ethiopian state was prepared for a struggle impending in its eastern and southern provinces, where Christianity was meeting increasing resistance from the forces of Islam. Islamic preaching had converted many of the people living on the peripheries of Ethiopian rule. In the late 13th century, various Muslim sultanates on Ethiopia's southern border fell under the hegemony of Ifat, located on the eastern Shiwan Plateau and in the Awash Valley. The Ethiopian emperor proved a vigorous campaigner, waged wars in all directions, to the Red Sea in the north, unincorporated areas in the south, and eastward against the Muslim state of Ifat. He established strategic garrisons to consolidate the newly conquered regions, creating a system of gults, or fiefs, in which the holders of the gult were paid tribute by the gult inhabitants. His heavy taxation of exports, especially of gold, ivory, and people that were transshipped from Ifat to Arabia, met with resistance. Aggrandizement into non-Christian areas was accompanied by internal reform and consolidation of the Christian state. As heads of the church, these Solomonic monarchs actively participated in the development of religious culture and discipline by building and beautifying churches, repressing pagan practices, and promoting the composition of theological and doctrinal works. Nevertheless, the relations between church and state were marked by conflict as well as cooperation. The rise of Shuan Solomonics had been preceded by a revival of monasticism in the Amhara areas, and the monks had an uneasy relationship with the new dynasty. The bolder ones among them condemned the dynasty's practice of polygamy, and not until the late 14th century was the conflict resolved, the royal court having won over the monks with rich grants of land. Zara valued national unity above all and feared Muslim encirclement. In 1445, he dealt Ifat such a crushing military defeat that hegemony over the Muslim states passed to the sultans of Adal in the vicinity of Harar. About 1520, the leadership of Adal was assumed by a Muslim reformer who became known as the Conqueror to the Muslims, and Ahmad the Left-Handed to the Christians. Ahmad drilled his men in modern Ottoman tactics and led them on the Hijad, or Holy War, against Ethiopia, quickly taking areas of the periphery of Solomonic rule. In 1528, the emperor was defeated at the Battle of Shimbrakur, and the Muslims pushed northward into the central highlands, destroying settlements, churches, and monasteries. In 1541, the Portuguese, whose interest in the Red Sea was imperiled by Muslim power, sent 400 musketeers to train the Ethiopian army in European tactics. The emperor opted for a hit-and-run strategy, and on February 21st of 1543, caught Ahmad in an open lake near Lake Tana and killed him in action. The Muslim army broke, leaving the field in north-central Ethiopia to the Christians. Meanwhile, population pressures had mounted among the Oromo, a pastoral people who inhabited the upper basin of the Juba River in what is now southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya. Oromo society was based upon an age-set system known as Geda, in which all males born into an 8-year generation moved together through all the stages of life. The warrior classes raided and wrestled in order to prove themselves. In the 16th century, they began to undertake long-distance expeditions, availing themselves of the collapse of the frontier defenses of both the Christian and the Muslim states. By 1600, the Oromo had spread so widely in Ethiopia that the emperor limited his government to what is now Eritrea, the northern regions of Tigray and Gondar, and parts of Gojam, Shiwa, and Wello areas that include the bulk of the Christian Semitic-speaking agriculturalists. Meanwhile, the church had barely revived following the destruction and mass apostasy of the Hijad era, which has found itself facing a different kind of threat from Roman Catholicism. However, ethnic, regional, and religious factionalism undermined the kingdom and led in 1769 to its collapse. The Age of the Princes, an era of feudal anarchy, had commenced. For most Ethiopians, life under the Age of the Princes was difficult. Power had shifted from the central court to the courts of regional princes, and they vied with one another in battle. There were no significant changes in the social order, but the oppression of the farming population increased as armies traversed the highlands, ruining the countryside and plundering the harvests of farmers. Nevertheless, significant developments were taking place in the south. Agricultural development in the Gebe River basin led to the formation of Oromo states to the southwest of Shewa. The Gonga people developed in their own states in the Kiva highlands on the west bank of the Omo River, and a line that claimed Solomonic descent established a formidable regional kingdom in northern Shewa. Shewa prospered in the growing trade of the Gebe states, and Shewa's self-proclaimed king and his successors expanded southward. By 1840, they controlled most of Shewa to the Awash River and enjoyed suzerainty as far south as Girage. The leader of the new Shewa state, his first years were marked by attempts at social reform after he took over northern Ethiopia. His effort to establish garrisons nationwide lost the allegiance of the already heavily taxed peasantry, and he alienated parish clergy by converting excess church land to military and secular tenure. Such measures gave heart to the regional aristocrats who returned to rebellion. The emperor held Ethiopia together only through coercion. In 1861, he conceived a bold foreign policy to bolster his kingdom and promote his reforms. In 1862, he offered Britain's Queen Victoria an alliance to destroy Islam. The British ignored the scheme, and when no response came, he imprisoned the British envoy and other Europeans. This diplomatic incident led to an Anglo-Indian military expedition in 1868. The commander paid money and weapons to Kasa of Tigray in order to secure passage inland. And on April 10th, on the plains below Ambamariam, British troops defeated a small imperial force. In order to avoid capture, the leader of Ethiopia committed suicide 2 days later. There's a new emperor of Ethiopia taking the name Menelik II in Wallo. On May 2nd, he signed a treaty of amity and commerce granting Italy rule over Eritrea. The Italian version of Article 17 of the Treaty of Wuchale made Rome the medium for Ethiopia's foreign relations, whereas the Amharic text was non-committal. Both texts agreed that in case of differences, the Amharic text was to prevail. Learning that Rome had used the mistranslation to claim a protectorate over all of Ethiopia. Menelik first sought a diplomatic solution. Meanwhile, during 1891 to 1893, he sent expeditions south in east to obtain gold, ivory, musk, coffee, hides, and enslave people to trade for modern weapons and munitions. In December of 1895, after 2 years of good harvest of Ethiopia's granaries, Menelik moved his army into Tigray. Rome believed that as few as 35,000 soldiers could control Ethiopia, but it was proved wrong on March 1st of 1896 at the Battle of Adwa, where the Italian general led 15,000 Italian troops on a poorly organized attack against Ethiopia's well-armed host of some 100,000 fighters. The Italian lines crumbled, and at noon a retreat was sounded. The emperor retired into Ethiopia to await negotiations, and on the end of October that same year, he signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa, which abrogated the Treaty of Wuchale. Menelik subsequently directed the Solomonic state into areas that never before under its rule. Between 1896 and 1906, Ethiopia expanded to its present size, taking in the highlands, the key river systems, and a buffer of low-lying zones around the state's central core. Revenues from the periphery were used to modernize the new capital of Addis Ababa, to open schools and hospitals, and to build communication networks. Menelik contracted with a French company to construct a railway between Addis Ababa and Djibouti, which thus spurred the exportation of the country's produce by foreign merchants in cooperation with the ruling elites. As Menelik aged, he appointed a cabinet to act for his grandson and heir designate, Yasu, a son of the Muslim Oromo ruler of Wallo. Under the emperor's death in 1913, Iyasu took control in his own right. Seeking a society free of religious and ethnic divisions, he removed many of Menelik's governors and integrated Muslims into the administration, outraging Ethiopia's Christian ruling class. During World War I, Iyasu dallied with Islam and with the Central Powers in the hope of regaining Eritrea and freeing himself still further from the dominance of the Shuan aristocrats. After the Allied powers formally protested, the Shuan aristocrats accused Iyasu of apostasy and subversion, and deposed him in the end of September of 1916. He was replaced by Menelek's daughter, but since it was considered unseemly for a woman to serve in her own right, a cousin of Menelek served as her regent and heir apparent. The prince developed the rudiments of the modern bureaucracy by recruiting the newly educated for government service. He also engineered Ethiopia's entry into the League of Nations in 1923, reasoning that collective security would protect his country from aggression. To brighten Ethiopia's external image, he hired foreign advisors for key departments and set about abolishing slavery, a process possibly helped by the stirrings in Ethiopia of a market economy. On April 1st of 1930, she died, and Defied declared himself emperor. He was crowned the power of the Trinity. On November 2nd, in July of 1931, the emperor promulgated a constitution that enshrined as law his prerogative to delegate authority to an appointed and indirectly elected by cameral parliament, among other modern institutions. During 31 to 34, he instituted projects for roads, schools, hospitals, communications, administration, and public services. The combined effect of these projects was to increase the country's exposure to the world economy. By 1932, revenues were pouring into Addis Ababa from taxes applied to 25,000 tons of coffee exported each year. His success persuaded Italy's ruler Benito Mussolini to undertake a preemptive strike before Ethiopia grew too strong to oppose Italian ambitions in the Horn of Africa. After an Ethiopian patrol clashed with an Italian garrison at the Welwel Oasis in the Ogaden in the November-December of 34, Rome began seriously preparing for war. He continued to trust in the leader continued to trust in the collective security promised by the League of Nations. Only on October 2nd of 1935, under learning that Italian forces had crossed the frontier, did he order mobilization. During the subsequent 7-month Italo-Ethiopian War, the Italian command used air power and poison gas to separate, flank, and destroy the emperor's poorly equipped armies. The emperor went into exile on May 2nd of 1936. For 5 years, Ethiopia was joined to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland to form Italian East Africa. During this period, Italy carried out a program of public works, concentrating especially on highways and on agricultural and industrial development. Resistance to the occupation continued, however. The Italians dominated the cities, towns, and major caravan routes, while Ethiopia and patriots harried the occupiers and sometimes tested the larger garrison towns. When Italy entered the Second World War, in June of 1940, the United Kingdom recognized the emperor as a full ally, and the emperor was soon in Khartoum, Sudan, to help train a British-led Ethiopian army. This joint first entered Gojam on January 20th of 1941 and encountered an enemy quick to surrender. On May 5th, the emperor triumphantly returned to Addis Ababa. Defying the British occupation authorities, he quickly organized his own government. In February of 1945, at a meeting with U.S. President FDR, the emperor submitted memoranda stressing the imperative for recovering Eritrea and thereby gaining free access to the sea. In 1948 and again in 1949, 2 commissions established by the wartime Allied powers and by the United Nations reported that Eritrea lacked national consciousness and an economy that could sustain independence. Washington, wishing to secure a communications base in Asmara and naval facilities in Massawa, and also to counter possible submersion in the region, supported Eritrea's federation with Ethiopia. The union took place in September of 1952. The monarchy gradually lost its credibility, especially as it became embroiled in intractable conflicts in Eritrea and with Somalia. Somalia's independence in 1960 stimulated Somali nationalists and Ethiopia's Ogaden to rebel in February of 1963. When Somalia joined the fighting, the Ethiopian Army and Air Force smashed its enemies. Somalia's consequent military alliance with the Soviet Union upset the regional balance of power, driving up Ethiopia's arms expenditures and necessitating more U.S. assistance. Meanwhile, an insurrection in Eritrea, which had begun in 1960, mainly among Muslim pastoralists in the western lowlands came to attract highland Christians, disaffected by the government's dissolution of the Federation in 1962, and the imposition of Amharic in the schools. At the same time, an increasingly radical student movement at Addis Ababa identified the emperor as an agent of U.S. imperialism and a landowning oligarchs as the enemy of the people. And all this gave strength and ideological justification to Eritrean rebellion. By the early 70s, one-third of Ethiopia's 45,000 soldiers were in Eritrea, and others were putting down rebellions in some cities. In January of 1974, there began a series of mutinies led by junior officers and senior non-commissioned officers who blamed the imperial elites for the impoverishment and for the country's economic and social ills. For the government, the situation was greatly worsened by drought and famine in the north, the denial of which became an international scandal. Unfortunately for the emperor and his government, they were toppled and executed and whatnot, so they are no longer in control of the country. But the new government issued a declaration of socialism on December 20th of 1974. And they are called the Derg, and they borrowed its ideology from competing Marxist parties, all of which arose from the student movement. One of them, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, believed so strongly in civilian rule that it undertook urban guerrilla war against the military leaders, and anarchy ensued in the following years. Meanwhile, in May and June of 1977, Somalia's army advanced into the Ogaden. The USSR leveled Somalia the aggressor and diverted arms shipments to Ethiopia, where Soviet and Allied troops trained and armed a People's Militia, provided fighting men, and re-equipped its army. Unable to entice the United States into resupplying its troops and faced with renewed Ethiopian military vigor, Somalia withdrew in early 1976, and the leader, which the emperor, quickly shifted troops to Eritrea, where by year's end the Eritrean nationalists have been pushed back into mountainous terrain. The emperor, which is still in power after many concessions, as well as the government, was embattled in most of Eritrea and Tigray, but the emperor simply stepped up recruitment and asked the USSR for more arms. In December of 1987, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front broke through the Ethiopian lines and waged increasingly successful war with weapons captured from demoralized government troops. In early 1988, Eritrea began to coordinate its attacks with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which had long been fighting for the autonomy of Tigray and for the reconstitution of Ethiopia on the basis of ethnically autonomous regions. The Soviets refused to ship more arms, and in February of 1989, a series of defeats and a worsening lack of weaponry forced the Ethiopian government to evacuate Tigray. Then they organized the largely Amhara Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement. Together, these groups formed the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, and the forces easily advanced into many of Ethiopia's provinces. By May of 1991, with their forces controlling a lot of the country, it was obvious that the Ethiopian army did not have sufficient morale, manpower, weapons, munitions, and leadership to stop the rebels' advance on Addis Ababa. The emperor fled to Zimbabwe, and on May 28th, the rebels took power. To this end, the rebels and other political groups, including the OLF, agreed to the creation of a transitional government that would engineer a new constitution and elections to a national charter that recognized an ethnic division of political power, and to the right of nationalities to secede from Ethiopia, thus paving the way for Eritrea's legal independence, which became official on May 24th of 1993. The economic reform efforts that had begun in 1991 were somewhat successful as the economy showed improvement in the mid-90s. However, some aspects of reform, such as privatization of state-owned enterprises, progressed slowly, and the government's cautious approach to economic liberation remained an obstacle for foreign investment, as did the issue of nationalized property, which continued to be a source of consternation. In 1998, simmering border tensions between Eritrea and Ethiopia erupted into war. At the heart of this dispute was some 250 square miles of land near Badme, but the conflict quickly spread to two other areas, including the important Eritrean port city of Assab. A ceasefire signed in June of 2000 provided for the UN mission to monitor the ceasefire and deploy troops in a buffer zone between the two countries while the border was being demarcated. A peace agreement signed in Algeria in December and it ended the conflict, although relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea remained tense. and UN troops stayed to monitor the truce and supervise the withdrawal of Ethiopian troops from Eritrean territory. The Ethiopian government was not pleased with the border demarcation proposed in 2002, as the town of Badme was awarded to Eritrea, and the leader protested this decision. Discussions continued during the next few years, but UN troops remained until July of 2008, but ultimately left with the issue of demarcation still unsettled. It was against this backdrop of conflict that the delayed federal elections were held on June 21st of 2021, though not across the entire country. Polls were not held in Tigray or in the Somali or Harari regions. The election board cited insecurity and logistical problems as the reason. However, elections were scheduled to be held in the latter two areas in September. In Oromia, elections were held, but opposition parties in the region boycotted the polls. When results were released in July, they showed that the Prosperity Party had won an overwhelming majority of the contested parliament seats. In March of 2022, the federal government declared another humanitarian ceasefire, which Tigrayan authorities agreed to observe. It provided a well respite from fighting and allowed for humanitarian aid to be delivered in Tigray and other affected regions. However, hostilities resumed in August and continued for a couple of months, during which federal troops made inroads into Tigray. Although a peace agreement has been reached in the Tigrayan conflict, the federal government still had to confront other security concerns, long simmering tensions, and periodically turned violent in other regional states, most notably Amhara and Oromia. In 2023, a rebellion broke out in Amhara, primarily led by Amhara militants known as Fano, whose reason for fighting include ending what they identified as the oppression of the Amhara people. In Oromia, a regional state with a long history of friction and periodic fighting with the federal government, conflict had erupted in 2019 and continued in the following years, rooted in unmet demands for greater autonomy for the Roma people. The fighting in Oromia was primarily led by the OLA. There were also clashes between Amhara and Tigrayan groups over territory they both laid claim to, as well as clashes between Amhara and Oromo groups over similar border disputes. Federal troops were dispatched to Amhara and Oromia to assist the regional state governments in their attempts to suppress the conflicts, though fighting persisted into 2024. There were allegations of human rights abuses being committed by all sides, especially with government forces. That was a long video, because Ethiopia is not like most countries, but they didn't have a full independence period, and they have very active history. But that is the summary of the history of Ethiopia. So I'll go over the 5 fun facts. The first fact was that Ethiopia was one of 2 countries in Africa whom were not colonized by Europeans, the other being Liberia. The second fact is that it is said that Ethiopia is the birthplace of the earliest humans. Third is that Ethiopia is perceived to be the diplomatic capital of Africa. The fourth is that the Pan-African colors on many African flags, such as Ghana, Mali, and Cameroon, among many others, are inspired off of the Ethiopian flag. And the last one is that time is counted differently in Ethiopia than in the rest of the world. So that is it for the history of Ethiopia. My longest history video in maybe over a year or so. And yeah, the next ones will not be this long. Even the France one that'll be soon, that won't be as long. So I'll see you all next time.